Good evening, everyone. It's Tuesday, April 1st. I'd like to call this regular meeting of the Darien Board of Finance to order. As is usual, the first item on our agenda is public comment. Do we have anyone in the public that wants to make a comment? If you wouldn't mind, either before or after, just write your name on the check-in list.
I did.
And then just come up to the podium here.
Sure.
Thanks.
Hello, my name is Chris Relia. I live at 6 Ridgeview Avenue. I'm here to advocate for an education budget that more accurately reflects the inflationary pressures that Darien has seen over the last few years. I'm a small business owner in town, and I appreciate that the Board of Finance is trying to balance maintaining an excellent school system without unduly increasing taxes. However, between 2022 and 2024, the school budget lagged behind inflation. Had the town kept pace with inflation in those years, the 2025 budget would be about $7 million higher than the budget that the BOE requested. Of the budget increase that the BOE requested, 93% came from contractual obligations, like an 11.9% increase in teacher health plan costs, an increase in busing costs, and increased utility costs. Darien spending per student is below the Connecticut Regional District 9 average by about $650. Moving forward, I would like the Board of Finance's guidance targets for the Board of Education budget to catch up to our regional peers and reflect the recent inflation. Thank you all for your service to the town.
Thank you very much. Anyone else in the audience? Going once, going twice? Okay. Well, this is another one of our fiscal 26 work budgets. We have budget work sessions. We have a number of things on the item today, but the largest of which is going to be the discussion of the Board of Ed budget, and then followed by that sort of debt service and investment earnings and a couple other smaller things. So what I was going to say, I see the entire Board of Ed team and administration is here. So I'm not sure if you guys want to, we'll have a number of questions for you. If you want to just come up to the table, Jim Cameron and the team at Channel 79 have just sort of asked that if people are talking, they be by one of these mics here or up at the podium, just because if not, he's found it's hard for them to record. I guess before we get started, Dr. Adley, I know you had a big announcement last week, and I would just tell you this is 6 years, 6 budget sessions. You've been a kind of great partner to your board, great partner to this town. You've certainly fielded a lot of tough questions and tough budgets from our board, from the RTM, and you and Rich and Marge and the team here have all done a great job, but particularly you as leadership here. So I just wanted to extend an early thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'll extend that appreciation to as you mentioned, to the rest of my team. But thank you. It's been an honor and a privilege, and it continues to be so. So I will look upon my time here very fondly. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Well, as they say, hard work makes friends. So we had over the past few weeks, we accumulated a number of questions, of which I sent to you last week, and I appreciate, we had a couple other stragglers kind of come in over the last few days, and you guys have sent across questions. So I think probably what I would suggest is we start with some of the questions that our board had, right, for you all. Rich put together, or you both put together a very detailed memo, which we've gone through, but it might just, I think, help for our board and the public to just to have a little bit of a discussion around those dozen or so questions. So one, we'll start off, on the overall budget. Obviously, the biggest piece of your budget is personnel expenses, and within that, certainly teachers are the largest group there. So one of the things that we had asked you to give us an overview on is how the teacher census has changed over the last 4 years. And I appreciate you guys put together sort of the census, if you will, how the contract is populated each year of those 4 years. And in looking at that, I saw a number of trends, and I would say a few of them, which maybe you could give us a little bit more color on, is, it certainly seems like a greater percentage of the teachers over the last 4 years are at the top step. By my calcs, that went from about 35.5% to 43%. One of the other trends, it seems like there's the number of teachers as you go sort of to the right across the matrix, less teachers in the first in the master's category and more teachers in the master's plus 15 and master's plus 30 and a little bit, smaller increase in the master's plus 60. Can you give us a little bit of a just background on how that's changed over the last few years and if there are any trends that we should be aware of?
Well, obviously we've gone from about 482 to 475 teachers, and yes, we certainly have more who are on the top step, and that's people working through the actual steps themselves to get there through their education, whether it's the masters plus 30 or 60. The number of credits that they earn and then the number of years of service. So they move up there, and then down at the lower end of the spectrum, we have been trying to be attractive to our new teachers coming in, and certainly new teachers will come in with some experience, and we've had an opportunity to experience a little bit where teachers have come in with experience from other districts or other service that they can get credited. Obviously, you've been through some of the negotiations, so some of the contractual implications have been implemented through those contractual matters, and I want to thank the Board of Education and also the town for recognising the teachers, because in this tough economy for the last couple of years, it has served the district well to be attractive and to actually teach or provide our teachers with fair compensation, and actually compensation that has been very competitive, in many ways has led the way a little bit. People tend to catch up, and we will be going through negotiations again next year, so we'll be preparing for that. But those are a couple of things. Yes, the observation of that the majority of our teachers, a large percentage of them, are at the top of the scale.
I also noticed, a lot of the discussion around the last contract was, as you mentioned, trying to bring in more lower step teachers, not entry level, but, on the lower side. It looked like the percentage of teachers that were in the bottom 10 steps, or in step 10 and below, I guess I should say, has fallen from like 25% down to around 19%. Have you found it harder to hire teachers in that area, which is part of one of the original?
So there just aren't as many teachers coming into the profession. And so when a teacher leaves at the top step, there aren't that many opportunities to hire a teacher who might be new to the profession. And so Marge just mentioned it, we kind of just trade teachers at this point amongst other districts in the area. And so we're bringing in a lot more like Master 10, 11, 12, 13, et cetera, where we don't really get anybody at that, Master's 5.
Okay. Any other questions?
What's the average number of applications you guys get when you have an opening for a teacher?
Marge is behind me, but elementary is like a ton, because there's a large population, and then there's areas that are really for mathematics, languages, so on and so forth. Those are very challenging areas because of the specificity of them, and whether it's science, mathematics, so on and so forth. Those are difficult areas. Administration's difficult areas. So it just depends. Elementary usually is a much larger pool than secondary level.
There are, Alan, correct me if I'm wrong, is an overall teacher shortage, but there's also teacher shortages in some of those specific areas, right?
That would be correct, yep.
Mathematics, special education, and foreign language, is that correct?
Yeah, those are the typical areas. It changes sometimes about the shortage area, but those are the typical areas that are shortage. But you could get through a large number of candidates, particularly in elementary level.
And what's a large number? I'm just curious.
I'm going to say 30 or 40, but let's go. The application will be much more than that, but that's where we'll reduce them to. How many would you say?
Probably 200 or 300.
There you go. So you have to simplify, so just to get in the doors, like 30 or 40.
And then how does that compare, Marge, to, let's say, like a high school physics teacher?
Where we'll get 50, maybe. And they're not all qualified.
Thank you.
So in terms of, as you're looking to hire, obviously you're looking to hire, the best and the right fit, but do you also target a certain, to maintain an overall average step within the census pool, just to help you all manage your expenses?
I honestly have to look at the bigger, the whole picture, but predominantly, what are the needs of our kids? Like what are the class needs? What are the school needs? What are the discipline needs? We can't tire, for instance, we don't want to tie ourselves down to certifications if we can. It depends what the certifications they have. If it's elementary, it's pretty straightforward. But I have to look at sort of the needs, actually, of classes, and particularly the needs of the students in general. So I keep an eye on the schedule. I don't want to get too crazy with it. And we do a good job between the members of our team, just sort of, because they're always part of the interview process at Cabinet. But at the end of the day, I have to, it won't be just a financial decision by any means. In fact, it won't be just, it definitely is not just a financial decision. But I also keep that in mind as to kind of where we are. If we have some options to, there's some highly qualified young people coming into the profession too. I think it's always nice to have a little bit of a mixture of both, and I think we try and do that as best as we can.
What percentage of our teachers are special ed teachers? Something that I should have asked earlier. I'm sorry if you don't know.
I would have to, off the top of my head, I'd have to just look it up.
Dr. Adley, I'd like to thank you for your service. I've been a resident of the town for longer than I'd like to know. Our family has over 100 years in the Darien school system. I've been on this board off and on for 20 years. I've been a school business administrator for 17 years. I consider you one of the best superintendents I've encountered in that time. And Jill, I sent you a note. I'd like to be considered on the search committee for his successor. But getting back to the teacher question, when teachers exit the system, what are the reasons they leave, and how are those reasons being addressed to help retain teachers in the future?
So we do an exit interview, and Mrs. Zion will do some of those, and I think you'll find that there's a couple of, Richard talked about where we're competitive, sort of between different districts. The same sort of reasons apply as to why people move. If you want to share some of those, Mark, I'm happy enough for you to do it. It's they do it for the locality of it, the travel, but if you would like to share those, you can, Mark.
Okay.
Can you come up to the mic, please, Mark? Thanks.
Thank you, Marge.
So we are much more competitive, so we're not hearing as much that they can go someplace and make more money than they are here, but they can go someplace where the commute is less and make the same amount of money than they make here. So it's a lot of the commute. Sometimes it's that they can bring their children to school in districts like Stanford and Greenwich. Sometimes it's the pressure, sometimes it's just change, but the commute is our biggest factor right now, and there's not really anything we can do about that.
Marge, what is the policy for allowing faculty members to have their children enroll in our schools if they're not residents?
So we don't allow that at the moment.
Okay.
Different districts either do it through negotiations, or they have board policies or town policies where they charge a percentage of per
Usually
pupil.
25%.
Can we stay on the topic of turnover for a little bit? I think one of the documents that we got was a staff turnover and exits interview, March, that you put together. So I'm kind of curious about teacher turnover, so I'll leave it the administration side for a second. So we have roughly, call it 460 to 470 teachers on the document you guys sent. We had 32 teachers left in 21, then 54, then 81, then it starts coming down to 66 and 41 only last year. So the year 2023 was an extraordinary year. Losing 81 out of 470 is, obviously a number in the high teens, right? And I don't have any context to put that against, except for a colleague of mine in Wilton said they average about 5 or 6%. But once again, that could be a standalone, could be an outlier. But can you talk about kind of, we started at 32 and we're kind of at 41 in a 5-year period. And this is for anybody on the board. I'm just kind of curious what caused the spike, if you want to call it that, what's caused this normalization, if you want to call it, to roughly about a 9% number. Or-
So I've been here for 10 years, and Darien has also always trended higher on turnover than surrounding towns. Like, we would be in the 70s and 80s, and surrounding towns of comparable size would be in the 30s or 40s. So last year was a great number for us, that it was only 40, and I think it has to do with the contract, it has to do with, with some of the things we put in the contract. And again, the commute's the commute, but there were just fewer people because of all of those. So it's actually come down since we've been around.
I think that spike also had a little bit to do with COVID. Some people got used to working from home, and so they made decisions to work closer to home. And so we did see that one blip where we saw that spike up to the 80 and then kind of went back down.
People left the profession in that year too, in those years, right after COVID.
It was interesting, you wrote, this is the first year no one singled out the pressures, quote unquote, of working in Darien, which I find kind of interesting, right, out of the 41. But this is an excellent document, so thank you for it. It kind of gives you a little bit of flavor. It's page 401 of the large doc that Jim passed around last night, just FYI. But thanks for the color.
Any other questions on teacher census? The small item, but the Perkins grant that you guys were recently awarded, that'll be the items that'll purchase are not anything that was in the fiscal 26 budget?
No, it's a school to career, right? That's
Yeah,
school
all
to career.
program enhancements, so like video broadcasting equipment and things like that.
Okay, so it's all kind of capital or items?
Yeah,
not-
like small.
Yep.
Okay. So on some of the capital items that exist inside the operating budget, some of them like textbooks where you've only spent like 80% of that line item. Rich, are there incremental textbooks that'll be purchased either online or in physical between now and like the
There
next
are,
60
so
days?
typically you would start.
Are they for this year or next
For
year?
this year. Yep, you'd start looking at orders for things like classroom libraries and things like that kind of in the second half of the year. And so the bulk of what's purchased are some of those bigger programs, like if you're buying a bigger math program or Spanish program, things like that.
But these are filling out, you're saying more library books for the end of the?
Like
year?
classroom libraries, yeah.
Okay. And on the athletic uniforms, just, I know we're in the spring season here, that's only about 75% spent. Like, are there additional library uniforms for this year that
There
we'll be
are,
buying?
so they're still working on getting all the spring uniforms, so it depends on when they get the rosters finalized and the measurements done. And so obviously all like the fall and winter uniforms have been purchased, but the spring uniforms have not yet. Incomplete.
The security appropriation that we approved, this was a capital item from last year. Looks like that's about $100,000 on the budget. Is that completely done?
It is complete.
Okay, so that'll be will that be closed out?
Yep, so we did give that as part of the list to Jen.
That was already on the closeout that you did earlier in the month.
Okay. So, getting back to Rob's earlier question, on question 4 regarding turnover, on average, like what was the difference in terms of, you mentioned 260,000 and kind of turnover savings. What was the average difference between those leaving and those that you hired? Marge, like if there was the average step of new teachers you hired versus those that left?
So I usually leave the numbers.
It's only around like $7,000 or so. It shrank quite a bit. It used to be that we could get like a $30,000 savings when a teacher left. That really hasn't happened in the last couple of years. We really made turnover this year because of the new paraprofessional salary schedule that's in place.
So what was like what's the average? I assume these are people that leave at the beginning of the year and you're hiring new?
For the most part, yeah. We do get the occasional people who leave during the year.
So what was like the average, if you will, step of those that have left versus those that have come in? It's
I
only
mean,
7,000?
mean, most of them are probably in like the 17, 18, 19 step, but we usually replace in like the 15, 16 step, so you're not getting that big difference.
And sometimes when they leave and they're at the lower steps, we can only find somebody
Right.
for special education that's up in the 15, 16, 17.
So what ends up happening is that teacher ends up costing more than the teacher department.
So, can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
So what is built into next year's budget, this salary savings because of?
So we have 40 teachers turning over, and we have about another, $260,000 or so of turnover savings. We have 15 paras we're assuming are going to turn over with about $8,000 per savings in that para as well. And then we have an assumption that 2 teachers at the middle school will leave to allow us to complete 4 to 5. So it's about $650,000 between all those categories.
And Rich, what about the savings moving across the grid? Either moving up in sort of credits and degrees versus down? Like, how do you bake that into the overall estimates?
So we do, we have it going both ways. So there's something called column change in RC 18. It's about $100,000, and that's actually the cost of people moving through the grid on a higher level. So people go from a master's to a master's 15 or master's 15 to master's 30. And then when we do the turnover savings, we are looking at a certain amount of people who might leave as a master's 60, maybe we're replacing them at a master's 30. And that's all built into that 265 number.
And Rich, the shift across the columns, is that primarily a result of, let's just say, turnover, or is it, I know we offer the teachers certain like tuition reimbursement, right? Or is that existing census
So
kind of moving across?
those are existing teachers who, we do offer tuition reimbursement, and they have to get approved in advance. And so when they get a certain amount of credits, they can change that column, whether it's from a master's to a master's 15.
Okay.
You called out in item 9, the special education para-educators have grown, it's one of the top, fastest growing items in the budget over the last 5 years. Is that just due to the increase in IEPs?
Yes.
And then it's also interesting to me that there are so many that were part of the turnover. Was that unusual? Is there any comment?
No, I mean, so typically with the paraprofessionals, either they stay for 30 years and we have them for a very long time, or they're in and out in a couple of years. It's not unusual for us, we have about 150 paras or so, to see 15 or so turnover every single year.
And is that turnover primarily in the instructional para
No, it's
subset,
primarily
or the?
special ed. I mean, we did have, I think it was 3 instructional paras turnover this year, but it's, I mean, the bulk of our paras are special education paras.
And 3 out of how many? Mine's
18, I believe.
18.
So we, 19. We have 3 at each elementary in the current year, and then we have 3 at the high school and 1 at the middle school.
Rich, how many hours do they put in on average? A week?
Their work day is a 6.5-hour work day.
5 days a week?
Yeah.
I asked the earlier question about the special ed teachers, just because it looks like from a percentage standpoint, if we lost 42 teachers and 21 of them are special ed, that seems like a high percentage. You think we're in the ballpark of 50-50 on teacher heads?
So we did look at that number, and some of that is teachers who went out on maternity leave. I think there were maybe 6 or 7 who had been out on maternity leave, so we had already replaced them and then notified us that they weren't coming back. So that's when we actually count them as terminated. So I think we're in the teens, and special education is a high turnover area in most districts.
Okay, so it's not abnormal.
No.
And has that changed at all? I know last year, one of the changes you made in the budget was insourcing a number of specialties that were outside. How has, and one of the questions in the back end of this is to talk about some of the changes that were made last year, but has that insourcing changed your staffing model, either from a cost or operational standpoint?
So from a cost perspective, we insourced occupational therapists, and that has saved the district a good amount of money, and Shirley was able to find 5 really good candidates to fill those roles, and we're proposing adding a 6th next year so that we're not contracting out that role in ELP, since it was successful at the elementary level. We did insource a couple of SLPs as well, and that did save some money as well. We did have difficulty finding one that had specific specialized training.
And the paraprofessionals, we insourced a bunch of them, and we were able to, with some creative advertising, find some people with really good behavioral skills, so it saved the district money and it was good for kids.
So question 5 actually talked about the actual staffing of the special education group. So Rich, you talked about occupational therapists in terms of maybe hiring an additional one. You know, listening to the budget discussion a couple months ago, you talked about sort of like a bottoms-up approach. How do you all determine the metric by which you need a certain skill set, a certain type of specialty? Like, are you looking at the number of hours that need to be delivered to each student? And like, do you have, one of the questions we had was like, do you track the number of, I guess it's hours, because really each child's getting a certain number of units, if you will. Do you track that year by year? So in a specific, I mean, the graph you provided kind of talked about the allocation within those, but not the allocation of. So do you have data that shows like the number of hours in different specialty that are provided across all IEPs and 504s?
So, for example, like when we did the OTs, we did look at the number of hours we were using for various contractors. Did it warrant having a full-time employee, or would it warrant having like a 0.6 or a 0.8? In the case of the OTs, there were enough hours when we started to look at all the contractors put together to warrant that. In terms of like the hours, I'd probably defer to Shirley in terms of something.
I would, and they're updated annually, so IEPs are annual reviews, we know how many hours of these related services indicated, and we look at that, and that goes right into our staffing requirements. We base our budget based on the number of hours we need, K through 12 plus, and we do that annually at the time of annual reviews. Annual reviews do happen all year long, so we have a pretty accurate idea month by month of what we'll be looking towards the next year.
So you have like the annualized hours that you deliver by profession, by specialty, I should say?
Yes.
Okay, and is that across the different schools?
Yes, it is.
Is that something that you guys have shared before, or the board has discussed or reviewed?
You'd have to look at hours, and you'd have to disaggregate all the IEPs, so what happens are the administrators in each of the buildings correlate all that information and see how many hours they need by discipline.
I mean, but you have that data, right?
Yes.
And so what do the trends look like if you look at some of the different specialties over the past like 5 years? Are there certain specialties where the quantum of hours that you all are like, I guess, adding up across all the IEPs, is that increasing or decreasing in certain areas?
Mental health is
Yep.
here.
Would you mind just coming up to the microphone? Thanks, Ben.
I'm good here. Can you hear me from here?
We need a bigger table.
I can go over there, I'll put, I can just pull a chair up over there.
Thank you.
I'll just take that.
There you go,
Thank
gentlemen.
Thanks, Jack.
So go back, mental health has been an area that has increased over the years, our school psychologists, and if you look at the trend over the last 5 years, we currently have 18 school psychologists. If you looked at us over the last 10 years, we've increased that by probably 7 psychologists over 10 years. That is due to the increase in mental health and the needs of our students. OT is another area that's increased. Now, part of it also is our enrollment in special education has increased. If you look at our numbers over, we were 802 several years ago, we're at 975 now. So the number of students you have increases the number of services that are indicated. But OT seems to be mental health and school psychologist and speech and language based on student need. There's a higher incidence of students with speech and language deficits, as well as students with autism, so we've increased our needs for specialized speech and language therapists as well.
Got it. Well, I think some of that would be helpful to look at if you have, like, I think you mentioned, like, speech and OT. If you have that shows me over the last 5 years, here's a number of hours, I guess you said, across all IEPs and 504s, how that has changed. Because I know that we certainly see like the costs have kind of grown a little bit over time. And certainly I think you've provided some great data on the number of IEPs, but I guess not all IEPs are created equal, right?
Well, it's probably easier not looking at individual IEPs, but looking at, for instance, if it's a 6.5-hour day for a speech pathologist and she is working every time with the exception of a lunch and a period, you know she's delivering services. So it could be 3 children in a group or 5 children or 1 child in a group. So the number of hours of delivery may be easier to quantify than how many children have how many minutes of services. There are some students who get speech and language 5 days a week, some students who get it 2 days a week, some groups of 1, some groups of 3. So you're really looking at caseload of the practitioner, and that's based on a 6.5-hour day, again, with a half hour for lunch and a prep period usually of 45 minutes, and the other hours are delivery of services. The administrators in the building manage those schedules and make sure that those are the services being delivered.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I wouldn't want us to over-commit here. The board has asked actually for a presentation on some of these topics coming in May, and given the space that we have and given the timing, I just don't want to overcommit to, I'm sure you need it, right? And we're trying to give you the answers, but I just don't want to overcommit to a major project here if we can help it.
Yeah, I mean, if this isn't data you already have, it's certainly not going to be put together in 2 days, but
Yeah.
if this is stuff you already have that show like those type of trends, it'd be great to take a look at. Just, again, for us to, I think, the bigger picture here is understanding, I think last year, you guys did some great work. I think you brought in a consultant and you looked at staffing in the middle school. And you found ways by which you could work to make that be more efficient operationally. And just, it's good to understand sort of.
And again, to Dr. Adley's point, I don't know that Connecticut SEDS, our student reporting program, could print out how many hundreds of thousands of minutes students receive it, or that would inform you any other way, other than the number of hours that our practitioners work and the periods they work is based on a full day. And they may have, some SLPs might have 20 kids on their caseload, and some might have 10 based on the number of hours. So it's hard to quantify that to Dr. Adley's point. But we'll share what we can.
The increase in, sorry, Paul, go.
Could you speak to the administrative workload that is required to track all this? I'm familiar with it. We used to have 2 or 3 people to properly allocate the services. So Rich and you can come and submit something to the state for excess costs. Could you just go through that and explain to the board all the work involved?
Well, for excess cost students who are, they're tracked by one of our administrative assistants, and then all of the special education secretaries in the buildings, hours and delivery of service hours. So we could show the cohort in excess cost tracking, because that is by minute and by hour that receives funding back from the state. The other administrative costs are really, and supports are really done by school secretaries. Clinicians do their appropriate administrative, they write reports, they do evaluations, but they're not doing tracking or doing that information. The other information is done, again, by our reporting system, Connecticut SEDS, or by the administrative assistants in the building. There's one in every elementary school, a special education dedicated secretary, collecting and sending out invitations, doing all the administrative work, and we have one in central office that does all our excess correlation.
And surely the use of CT SEDS, which stores all of the IEPs and the resultant data, is required by the state. Can you talk about the analytics back end on that wonderful system?
It switches from 2 years ago. IEP Direct was a system which was a private system. The state put into a state system that is supposed to have a crosswalk between all the different diagnostic information for students. It gives us the SBAC scores, it gives us all the different data, it tracks attendance, it tracks services, it tracks and manages the whole IEP system. It's been about a 2-year learning experience. There's still glitches in it. We're probably one of the more positive districts that are really moving forward through it, with getting tutorials all along the way.
The analytics
So let me put you on the
capability are
spot, like in
limited.
terms of this software here, I've had experience with some of the other systems that the state uses. Do you think this system is sufficient for what Darien kind of wants to be able to manage and track everything that you all feel is important, or do you feel like there's?
State required.
It's not optional. It's a state requirement. We can only use a system now.
No, but is there something else that you think you need besides that?
Well, I don't know if there's another reporting system we need. We have our own system. We have an Ames web system which looks at our own data inside internally. We have our own internal systems that we use for tracking both quantitative data and qualitative data of students in terms of performance. So I don't think we limit our internal. All our benchmark data is done in Ames web as well. So we have other reporting systems for students. But we are required to use Connecticut SEDS for all state reporting.
The increase in IEPs in the last 5 years, 975 from 802. Can you help me understand again where the process starts that that a student perhaps would need those services? Is it school generated? Does the parent have concerns that go back to the school? Is it a little bit of both? If you can speak to that a little bit.
It's both plus more. It can be, a referral can be made by a parent, by a school personnel, by a physician. It can be made by several members. It is a process where there's a referral made, then there's a PPT-1. That PPT-1 determines if the evaluation is appropriate. Then they go through an evaluation process, and then children are referred to a PPT-2, which determines eligibility.
Could you explain the burden of proof to the board? I don't think many people realize what that involves.
Well, the burden of proof is really when you're looking at due process.
Yes.
So in due process, there are due process hearings. If families disagree with the recommendation done by the PPT committee, they have options. They have several different options. They have an option for mediation with the state. That's a state mediator that comes in. And they also have the option for due process. And the burden of proof, which is what you're referring to, the burden of proof is who has to first show that they have provided a free and appropriate education to the family. And it has switched over the years. And right now, the burden of proof is on the district.
And we're only one of 6 states, I believe, that has the burden of proof on the district.
At this time, yes.
And did you say that switched recently?
There was one time, well, in New York anyway, in New York State, they had switched actually. It was no longer on the district, but they reversed it again.
Thanks.
And if we go to administrative law judge or whatever, we have to pay all court costs if we lose, correct?
Yes.
Including the families.
Connecticut is only like one of a couple of states that actually the burden of proof resides with the school district and not with the families.
But Dr. Adley, on that, regarding Fitch, this is a program I think has been in place for 7 years now, 8 years now.
Thereabouts, yeah.
Any update on how is that working? Is that
Fitch is we have about up to 24 students on any given. I mean, it's a rolling enrollment type thing. Kids actually can come in and can come out of Fitch. It's one of the most positive, successful programs. We don't take people in and out from other districts because basically people have their own nowadays, to be honest with you. Most of the districts have created something similar. This is a program that was successfully implemented. It was a great idea for whoever came before, and it was a great idea to be supported by the board too. So this serves our young people and in a personalized environment that serves their needs, that they always can't just accommodate or come accustomed to the high school, the sort of everyday operations of the high school for different reasons, and this is a more personalized experience. We have teachers who come over from the high school over to Fitch and come back and forth. We have some full-time staff here or there, but it's one of the most successful programs we have actually. I'm very proud of that program, proud of the kids who are in it, and proud of the staff who support our young people and our families in that program. That's one that you, our board, should feel very proud of. And the board asks for updates on Fitch occasionally, right? And we would provide those. And so right now there's probably about 17 kids in there, young people.
And is a large percentage of those kids that attend there kids that you would, prior to Fitch, otherwise have to be outplaced in terms of out of district, or?
Potentially. But they're not, I just want to make, they're not all necessarily receiving special services in that program. They're there for different reasons, just in terms of school attendance, difficulties in the high school setting. High school is not the setting for everybody. And we work closely with our students and families to make sure that they have a successful experience.
Is this a program you feel like should be expanded in terms of
It's
size?
difficult because we did expand it. We expanded the space a little bit over at Jerry's, the flowers. He does a great, by the way, I have to shout out Jerry, does a fabulous job for the town, the school system, and particularly our kids over there. He will do anything that he can to accommodate us. And we did expand the space a little bit to give an extra general classroom space and another school psychologist space, just to give the kids a little bit of difference, so that there's 2 spots for them to go, and they don't have to. We could split a class. Like, for instance, you don't have to teach Algebra 1 and Algebra 2 together, right? And you can split it a little bit. So that was the growth, some of the growth that we actually saw. I wouldn't. It works at the current allotment that we have. We don't have plans to expand it. Certainly down the line, we may look at opportunities to provide other services, types of services to young people, but that one is currently serving the need very, very well.
And from a facility standpoint, I know they're doing work, the bigger development down there. Will you have access to that?
Well, we are currently we have a contract with Mr. Nielsen, so that currently isn't going to affect us at the moment.
Okay.
One more. I know we've seen a spike in identification rates of special ed students in the last few years. Is there, common sense would tell me that maybe that's linked to COVID. Is there any evidence that maybe it's starting to cool down a little bit now, or that we're seeing any changes, or is there any academic research out there suggesting that those rates might come down again, or no?
Can I just respond to that also?
You may.
We're actually, to your point, Dr. Adley, we're actually presenting, again, there's not an answer to it, just so you know, but we are looking at a self-study of some of the contributing factors to that. There is a bump that happened in COVID, and you can see that with the 5th grade class coming into the high school, into the middle school next year. But we are looking at that, and that will be something that we'll be speaking to at our May 13th presentation.
Thanks.
There's not an answer, though, just so you know. It's not that there's an answer that I would say right now we have an answer. But we're looking at trends, and we're looking at identification rates, and we're looking at what grades it appears on, and what are some of the factors. So that would be one of the factors, but there is a higher identification rate consistent with Connecticut and the state of Connecticut, and we showed those trends in similar districts and.
But over that same period of time, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's just interesting, right? If it is related at all, it'd be interesting to see if it comes down in the next few years.
Well, we are
I was just
looking at
curious.
that.
Yeah.
Okay, next question was on mental health, in terms of how many staff members are dedicated to mental health initiatives and so forth. I did note from the chart that you provided, it's interesting looking at the actual, what we're actually spending has gone up in sort of each of the categories that have been in place for a long time. Mm-hmm. And each year there seems to be new categories that pop up. So I think we're expanding, certainly by looking at this, we're expanding the programs that have been in place, and in most years instituting new programs.
So we actually did a comparison for the board during the actual budget process. They asked much the same question, or certainly a similar question in terms of finances. So first of all, I would say that if you went back to the board presentation, you would see the board questions that they asked. You would see that we were top of comparative school district, right? But I just share with you, we're being very transparent, is not the right word, but we're being very inclusive of everything that we can think of that falls under the umbrella of mental health. When people say that they have psychologists or otherwise, they may put things in, leave things out. I'm not so sure it's just a complete one-to-one comparison. Nothing really is, actually, until you get under the hood of it. But with that, I'll say this is another area, I think back in 2022, in the period of like a couple of months, we had tragedy, several tragedies that struck our community, and in particular our young people at the high school. Thereafter, and I want to thank the board and recognize the board for its leadership in supporting the recruitment and the hiring of Dr. Dad, who is our Director of Mental Health, to oversee our programming. If there's something that has come out of COVID, if there's something that is prevalent with young people nowadays, it's issues of mental health and self-regulation. If you talk around town, right, and just drop in Dr. Dad's name, right, anywhere to people who even aren't part of the school system, you'll find that she is tremendously highly respected for her expertise for her compassion, for her leadership. This is an area where sometimes, Mr. Chairman, you would often say, sometimes we want to lead in certain areas. Right? This is one of the areas where Darien Public Schools have led, continues to lead, and continues to be a model for any district around the state in terms of higher service and our young people. Our young people who have experienced some of the things that they've experienced, and young people who haven't, are also experiencing mental health and challenges along the way. I don't think you have to. I don't think you have to look too far to feel that, experience that, acknowledge it. But I will tell you that the hiring of Dr. Dad has been just a terrific thing, both for the school district and also for the town. Has worked very collaboratively with the town. She also serves some some legal legislative priorities. That's like the school climate coordinator. That's mandated. Mandated is also a district family care coordinator. That's mandated. The athletics, mental health plans for students, that's mandated. So these are things that, in addition to what she's doing, there are some legal requirements that she has also serviced, and as she works with our young people pre-K actually through grade 12. You'll see some things on this list here. The wellness coordinator, these are some things that in collaboration with her and the high school that we've implemented, that and Teen Talk. Truth be told, the board sitting here, for those who have longevity, right? The board suggested Teen Talk to the superintendent. It took me a while to actually warm to it at the time. Ms. McCammon might remember that a wee bit, but it was actually suggested at the board table for some years, and it took a little bit of time just to make sure that it was a program that we actually wanted to put in place, and it has been very successful. This year, Teen Talk's gone into the middle school, where needs are pretty significant in terms of the number of kids who need it, and to support the actual school psychologists and counsellors and crisis management. The community fund was kind enough to fund 50% basically, which was $50,000 for middle school Teen Talks, where we thank them for their partnership and as they understand what the young people are experiencing at the minute. So things like the Wellness Centre and Teen Talk are probably new. School psychologists always deal with self-regulation, mental health, social and emotional wellness of students. So that's why we sort of list there. We list the whole Fitch program under there to support our young people in that capacity. So it's an area that, yes, is significant. But it's an area that I would suggest to this board and to the Board of Finance and to the Board of Education that is critical to the culture, to the needs of our students and staff. And in the area of leadership, we have been fortunate to hire basically a superstar, in my opinion, in this arena. And actually, if we change that, that would be the culture of that and the programming that's being done, that would honestly suffer.
Dr. Allen, I think you guys have done a great job building this up. I think if you've been on for 6 or 7 years, I think this is my 8th year. I think if you remember, my question always on a day like tonight is, the only thing I ask is what, do you have enough resources for mental health? So I appreciate the efforts you guys have put in here. If I can ask just one kind of smaller question, just looking at the budget. It says DBT training was not in this year's budget. Has that resource been kind of converted somewhere else within the budget? I apologize if I'm getting
Dr.
too
Dad
deep
does
here.
it now, as opposed to being contracted out.
Okay.
She actually also teaches not only our staff about the skills and stuff that the young people need. We also bring in other people from other districts and to be part of the training alongside our teachers. That's kind of how well known she is and her expertise level.
I think Dr. Dad has other responsibilities away from just mental health, right?
Again, I've listed some of those, like the school climate coordinator, so she's responsible for all the school climate plans. She's the person who under bullying legislation who people have to go to, and that is like, that's significant, not necessarily significant the number of bullying incidents, just the actual time and processes that you have to go through are pretty significant. So she does that. She does professional development for staff. She's developing a wellness plan for the adults as also. So she has a number of responsibilities there. Yeah. To work alongside crisis management, prevention, MTSS. She does a wee bit of everything, but she's predominantly there to lead the mental health needs of the district.
You know, I'll make a point, you know, with 2 kids currently in high school and 1 that already graduates, with 3 going through the district and spending time with 75 different teachers, administrators, and coaches. I feel like there's one large line item that's missed here, which is the 475 teachers, 35 administrators who also are a core part of this, the overall mental health of the school as well.
Well, I could put down, listen, in all due respect, I could put down every teacher in the district as part of mental health. Like, I mean, I know names come around, go around, right? Let's not, if you didn't call it that, the teacher in front of you, a teacher in front of your children, like, you might not like the sound of it, but they respond to the mental health and social and emotional needs of your kids. If you don't think that's the case, like that's what we do, right? And how we do the implementation and teaching, they all go hand in hand. So we could continue to list like a lot of staff members.
I think that was my point, is that I think the overall mental health initiative is sort of district-wide. It's not just a handful of positions that happen together.
It is totally district-wide, and it's totally embraced. It's also goes outside the greater school community to the community in general, who, if you see some of the presentations that are taken at the high school, the clubs and experiences and workshops that they have to go through at the start of the year, so on and so forth, are organised there by the school administration with Dr. Dad. Some of the community events that we're hosting are just phenomenal around this area, and that's in collaboration with our organisations in town. It's a good investment.
Okay. Can we talk about one of the questions we had in here with some of the changes that were made last May in terms of calibrating the budget to the reduction that the Board of Finance made? There's some fairly large dollar amount changes in here. Can you go through some of the larger line items on question 15 in terms of that comprise, you know, the Board of Finance reduced the budget by $2 million. And then you all reduced it by another almost $500,000. I think it'd be helpful to understand just some of the larger items.
I'll let Rich talk to some of the detail, but like one of the largest ones is the middle school teachers. All right, we're going for 4 to 5, so we took another 2 teachers above the superintendent's budget. So that's half of it. If you want to talk to any more of it.
I mean, on the smaller scale, we did defer some technologies, some ViewSonics and some laptops, as Dr. Adley mentioned. We did accelerate some of the transition from teachers at the middle school teaching 4 to 5. We had 7 teachers depart, and so through attrition, we can move forward for that 4 to 5. And currently, we have 2 subject areas left, 2 teachers left. We had maintenance staff, so the maintenance custodians and the paras, we all negotiated new salary schedules. So as new employees go on, they go on at a lower cost, and it kind of creates turnover now for some of those non-certified staff. And so we had some staff in the maintenance department go to a new salary schedule. We had a reduction in Spanish, so we did have Mandarin introduced at the middle school, and as that kind of pushed through, it pulled kids from Spanish, and so we did reduce the Spanish teacher as well. We insourced some items. We insourced background checks in HR. We insourced some groundskeeping, the SLPs and the OTs that we talked about earlier. We insourced part-time cleaners at the high school. we created what's called a food service subsidy, and so we transitioned to Chartwell's a few years ago, and it's been very successful both operationally and financially. And so rather than storing a lot of those excess profits in the cafeteria fund, we're running that at essentially a break-even point and taking those subsidies and creating a credit in our budget. And then we piloted field advertisements on the field at the high school, and that's been very successful in a partnership with the Booster Club. And so that's created a little bit of revenue as well.
Did you say that there's still some conversion from 4 to 5?
So in the budget for next year, there's one sort short in Spanish and one short in math. And so the budget assumes that we will lose a teacher in both those areas so that we can complete the 4 to the 5.
Okay.
Is that expected to be done through attrition? Like
So
most
it
of
has
these
to be, so
others?
it does have to be done through attrition. We can't do it any other way per the teacher's contract. So we do have a math teacher who is going to leave at the end of the year, so that portion will happen for sure. And then we're waiting to see if the Spanish teacher leaves.
So last year's, by these numbers, about 940, and I think the number for next year is about 200,000.
About 50, yeah.
So it's about $1 million,
A little over
almost $1
$1
million too, yeah. And all of these operational changes, the other ones will kind of have flowed through to operations in fiscal '28?
Yep.
Do you touch on the considerations in calculating your excess cost reimbursement for next year?
Sure. So in this year, originally we had budgeted 75, and then one of the adjustments was to bring it down to 70, as we were expecting not to receive as much. And then the state announced that we were going to receive roughly 60%, so a lot less than we anticipated, which would have created a deficit for the current year. The legislature and the governor passed a $40 million appropriation for this year, which will now bring us back up to about 72.8. The governor's budget, and it's not final yet, doesn't have that 40 million in fiscal 26, has it in fiscal year 27. So right now we're assuming 65% for next year.
And then Rich, back up in 2027, they're going to put it back.
Correct. So I would think unless we see an explosion in cost throughout the state, we'll see a reimbursement rate that's higher. I mean, one of the reasons why the reimbursement rate keeps getting depressed is costs keep rising throughout Connecticut, and the pot at the state has been relatively flat for a while.
Yeah, I think Paul points that out when we start talking
It's
about
led
this.
for like 10 years at 140.
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand funding it, not funding it, and funding it
Yeah, it
again.
doesn't make any sense.
So it does leave the board with a projected balance for the year for over 400,000.
So in terms of the projection built in for, for next year, do you believe that's conservative, aggressive? How do you view that? And I ask because, you know, we talk about sort of budgeting conservatively, but if we budget revenues, regardless of what the revenues are, too conservatively, then what we're doing is overtaxing our residents. And if we budget them, you know, too aggressively, then we may have to kind of dip into the general fund, of which we keep $30+ million around. Kind of like to, at least I prefer to budget sort of like spot on.
So I think we tried to kind of bridge the gap a little bit. I think if we were going to be aggressive, we'd probably be either 60% or lower, given that $40 million isn't available for next year, and we were looking at roughly a 60% renewal or a reimbursement rate. One could assume that we'd either be at 60 or potentially even lower for the following year, as the odds, one of two things either has to happen. Either costs for special education across the state have to come down, which haven't really happened anytime recently, or the state has to put more money in it. If one of those two things doesn't happen, then your reimbursement rate's not going to go up. So we did 65%, which is slightly bit higher than the original 60 that we're going to get. But there's also other factors that play into that. If our costs end up being less than we assume, because maybe a student comes back from district or a student goes out of district, some of our most expensive students are actually in-district students, that could change what we end up submitting. If we have higher turnover in terms of turnover savings and special education teacher salaries, that could lower what we're going to submit. So we thought that 65% was really more of an accurate reflection of what we could say.
Then, given the increase here, the current projected budget surplus for the Board of Ed budget was about 450-odd thousand?
So 460 was the last we put
Yeah.
forward.
And are there any line items within that budget that you haven't closed out yet that you think could drive that number higher or lower? Because as you know, for the past like 5 or 6 years, that number as well as the number that Jen's pulling together for the town in terms of that surplus are two things that have been direct inputs in terms of how this board has kind of set the overall tax rate and determined budgets.
So there's a couple things that could fluctuate it either way. One is we always look at long-term substitutes, so we have a certain forecast that we have in terms of people who are going to be out on leave, whether it's a maternity leave or an illness leave. If somebody comes back a little earlier than we expected or stays out a little longer than we expected, it can fluctuate either way. Recently, we've had a couple of students who've come back to district, which has actually freed up some money, which has resulted in that $460,000. If we had another student, either a placement's been changed or has come back to district, that could fluctuate it. I'm not expecting it really to be much more than that 460. We're working on the March financials now, and we're probably going to be in that same ballpark.
Okay. And I think, remind me last year, I think you all came in front of us in April or May for a $180,000 shortfall that you were concerned you were going to have a deficit, and I think we gave it to you. I think that was even before the budget was, the new budget was approached. And at the end of the year, I think, Jen might correct me here, I think
we gave back about
$104,000?
No, we gave back about $1,300.
About what?
$1,300.
$1,300. Okay.
Have you considered a non-lapsing account into which to put that $460,000?
So we had a brief conversation at Finance Committee in February, March, kind of just broaching the topic and what it would look like, and so the board would have to decide whether or not they want to vote to establish one, and then either vote to fund it or not fund it.
Yeah. Well,
We have
I don't
different
know.
opinions about that, Paul.
Yeah.
There are different opinions about that.
Yeah. I would say,
I realize that.
I'll share my opinion is that I think that we're supposed to be budgeting expenses for each year in that given year, and if there are shortfalls, as I think we've always told you, you should be coming back to us, like you did last year, even before the budget was passed, to fund those. And if there are excesses, I believe they should be brought back to the town and then used to lower the overall tax rate for our residents next year, because we've consistently kind of pumped those back in to fund capital costs in order to keep the tax rate down. I don't know if others have views on that.
Yes. Concur. Yep.
Okay. Healthcare, in terms of other big costs, right? The Board of Selectmen is renegotiated with United Healthcare to get premiums down a little bit lower than what we had expected, and are currently considering the state plan. Tell us a little bit about kind of how healthcare costs have performed on your side.
Sure. So we've been in a period of large claims. So our renewal for next year is 11.9%. So we do go out to market to see if there's anything better. We talk to our peers. We are in a consortium of about a dozen other communities, not necessarily boards of ed, but other communities, so that we have a purchasing block to try to drive some of those costs lower. We've seen in the last couple of months claims getting a little bit better, but we do have a high cancer claim population that's been driving up our renewals. And so the last couple of years we have seen that double-digit renewal. Prior to that, we were really in that like 6 to 9% range. Last year we were about 13, and next year we're going to be at 11.9. It is one of the driving costs. So we've looked at anything from going in the state plan, going to self-insured, looking at other models, other vendors besides Anthem. All have kind of come back with the decision that Anthem and the purchasing block that we're in is really the most optimal model for us.
How many covered lives you have with the other 9 communities that you have? Because we're obviously about 670, or 620.
Yep. We're probably like in the middle. I think Naugatuck is the highest, but I would have to check how much we have in total. It's definitely over 5,000.
And Rich, it looks like the census, if you will, it's actually moved a little bit, I would say, to reduce costs, because there's a bit more single and less families.
Yeah. So one of the things that's unique in our district, we have a lot of employees who waive, and so when I speak to other districts, we have about 30% of our population who waive insurance, and so that's actually driven costs down. Most districts are not nearly really close to that 30%, And so we've seen, as teachers have turned over, we've lost some, we've lost some more senior teachers, we've lost family, and maybe they've gone to employee plus one. As some, paraprofessionals have turned over, they've gone from family to maybe employee plus one as well. And so that's really also kind of mitigated a little bit of the increase that we've seen over the years.
So Rich, in the table you provided, like the 613 total employees, is that net of the 30% that you're talking about that don't?
Yeah.
Okay.
Rich, on the schedule you sent, it has costs and then it has HSA contributions. Wouldn't you total it both up to get that total? Because I think,
Yes.
then I think the math might be a little bit off.
So what you're looking at the premium share, you're looking
Yeah.
at the HSAs together. Oh, yeah, I see what you're saying. Yes, you're right. It should go the other way around.
Okay.
Yes.
I just wanted to.
Yep.
But that's, the HSA is our contribution.
It's our contribution to the employee, correct.
One of the things I'm just using a 19.5 employee number and 613 lives. So I'm getting like $32,000 a person. Like,
Right.
And maybe I might be wrong, but, and I'm just using some of my experience, and 60% is single or employee plus one. So it feels like a higher number, so I don't know if we can do a comparison to other places. Maybe you just put that on your list for me, but it feels a little high to me at $32,000 a head. And that's our cost, right? What's the cost to teach or to people with covered lives?
What do they pay?
Yeah, is it
So
5, 10, 20?
So it varies. So the teachers are going to 23%, our paras are at 21, our secretaries are at 20, the custodians and maintenance are at 21.
Which is kind of like most.
Yeah, I mean, most districts.
Privately, it's usually 80-20.
Yeah, so most districts are in like that 20 to 25% range.
Yeah.
We've actually been going back and forth a lot with New Canaan right now in terms of our cost versus their cost. They've been getting a lot of questions about insurance. It's a popular topic because it's a growing expense. And so our cost per plan is actually a lot less than New Canaan in terms of their allocation rates as a self-funded entity. And so they've been looking a lot at our data, we've been looking a lot at their data to see whether or not, is it viable for us to go self-insured? Is it viable for them to go fully insured? So our cost per person at, roughly that 32, because that's about an employee plus one, it's actually a little bit lower than New Canaan. I've actually talked to a couple other districts. One district got a 73% renewal rate. And so when you see
Increase me?
Yeah, 73% renewal rate increase.
Self-insured?
No, fully insured. And so it's, a lot of Westport a couple of years ago got a 42%, I think it was, renewal rate. And so it's definitely something that's hitting all the area towns.
Yeah, I think it's just a trend across the country. Like it's not slowed down across the board, no matter how you look at it. Yeah, but if you could just get that, it sounds like you're working already with New Canaan and other places, but I appreciate your help on that.
So Rich, one question we had, and I think one of the gentleman that spoke in the beginning for public comment talked about what we spend per pupil versus what some of the other towns do. And I know, there's some correlation between smaller schools. It's just, there's less administration administration is less amortized over less students, right? But when you look at some of these costs, like things like security, right? Like in Darien, the SROs happen to sit in the police budget, and healthcare sits in your budget versus in New Canaan. It's sort of a transfer, if you will, in on behalf of the Board of Ed. When these numbers are reported, how apples to apples are these numbers?
So it's all based on the EFS report that districts submit to the state on September 1st. And so even though things might not sit in our budget, there's things called like in-kind services. So the SROs, for example, are an in-kind service that actually are included in our per pupil, even though they're not in our budget. And so you do see that apples to apples comparison. Ridgefield, for example, they do have some of the SRO costs in their Board of Ed budget, but even though it's not treated the same on a budget to budget look, they are treated relatively similar to that per pupil outlook, because you are looking at that in-kind allocations. It's like the crossing guards, for example. The crossing guards are in the police department budget, but that's also treated as an in-kind service.
And what about things like healthcare? We talked about where New Canaan does a large.
So like for New Canaan, for example, they have a separate fund, almost kind of like what you could consider like the cafeteria fund, and then they have a an amount that's called a contribution to the internal service fund, and it's that contribution that's in their operating budget. So that's all included in their per pupil. Now, when they make that contribution to the internal services fund, depending on how their claims go, that contribution could be too high, it could be too low, and you can end up with a higher balance or a lower balance depending on how claims shake out. So that surplus that's kind of sitting there might not be factored into their per pupil because it is separate, but whatever that contribution that they're making into it in that given year, that's included in their per pupil.
Or if they draw down from the surplus, like that is, okay.
You could have a couple of districts who, the way they handle something like technology, it could be in a capital budget and not in their operating budget, so therefore there's...
I mean, one of the things you'll see in our DIRG is typically the smaller districts tend to have that higher per pupil because there just aren't certain costs, like you said, that really spread out over a population. Everybody has a superintendent. It doesn't matter if you have 2,000 kids or you have 5,000 kids, right? So that cost isn't going to spread out quite as evenly. So it's not always that easy to say. You can see some districts up north that might have like a $35,000 per pupil expense. It's not because they're spending exorbitantly more money than, let's say, a Darien or a New Canaan or a Westport. It just has a lot to do with that student population.
And Rich, what about debt, remind me, is debt service, an allocation of debt service included in that number as well? It's not.
So the SRO report tries to kind of standardize costs across all districts, right? So
for the most part, it's in the districts in our DIRG, it's almost always in the police department's budget. Ridgefield has a portion of their SROs in their board's budget, but like I said, it is considered an in-kind service, and so it is credited within that per pupil.
And that nets out things like the portion of our IT director that sort of services the town that goes the other way as well.
Right.
There are only 3 districts that spend more than we do, and 2 of them are materially smaller, and the third one is Westport, and it's $400 per student difference. So the observation that we're spending less than our peers is just not factually accurate. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, we're really kind of in that range of New Canaan and Westport. I mean, if you look at the DIRG, I mean, Weston, Easton, and Reading, Region 9, they're obviously a much smaller district, and then Wilton and Ridgefield are kind of on the lower end.
And Rich, should we look at this with or without ELP? That was my question, just in terms of looking at the spending, because our ELP program has grown a bit, I think, since we expanded Oxford, right?
It has. So I think we have the second largest in the DIRG, preschool program next to Westport. It is an expense to the district. Even though we have tuition students coming in, it's still going to be an expense. So it really is part of that per pupil.
So, that was one of the questions I had. When we think about ELP, is that program, is that a net revenue positive, net revenue negative from the tuition that you all are charging, which I think has gone up each and every year over the last 10 years I've been following this. But how does that compare if you were to measure the marginal costs of running ELP versus the tuition that you're charging?
So the tuition does not cover the cost of running the program. We can't charge, we can only charge tuition to the typical peers, so it's about half of the population in ELP that charge tuition. Those students also don't receive transportation, for example. That's only applied to the other half of the students. But it doesn't cover necessarily the cost of the program.
But how do you think about sort of net costs per pupil on that in the ELP program?
What we really look, how much can we charge compared to our peers? The higher we bring it, is somebody going to look at one of the area preschools and say, I'd rather go there. So we're always kind of aware of what that is. One of the things that changed was when we went from 4 days to 5 days, we became a little more comparable with some of our peers, and so then we started to benchmark more to Westport, which is when you saw the dramatic increase in tuition.
And has ELP come down a bit, I think, over the past few years in terms of overall attendance?
No, we've had more students this year. I think it's the highest number we've had.
It's gone up?
It's been up and down. It went down in COVID and in that subsequent years, and then it's returned, and now it's at a really high level.
And do you think there's a new place opening up in Norotan Heights? I've got the name of the school. But do you think that'll affect it at all, or?
I mean, it's potential. I personally send my children to the Goddard School, not Darien, but another school. But typically when you're going to a school like that, you're looking for a longer program because the parents are working longer. So if my child goes, 8 in the morning until, after 5, you're not going to get that with ELP.
I think that's most of the questions here. Do others have?
Just a comment. I've always asked about mandates, and you were nice enough, Dr. Adley, to give me, so I'm not sure if the whole board got this, and I'll pass it around if you guys have it. So for 7 years, the state mandates, so this is 15 through 22, there's 50 pages of mandates. And there it is. Yeah, there's the printed version of it. So there's roughly 6 to 8 on each page. So you're looking at 300 to 400 mandates that have been given to the schools and that's through 22. So obviously missing 3 years. So thank you for A, for the production of that, and B, some of them are just silly, right? Like it's just, but I'll pass it to the board just because I think I've been asking for like what percentage. I think you guys put 85, and when you read that document, you realize how you get to 85% of the
And there's something you just physically can't do. The number of hours for professional development, professional learning for staff, you simply can't do.
I would think over the last 3 years too, probably.
I'm glad they kept the potato famine in the curriculum, though. There's another regulation.
Yeah.
But I'll circulate it to the board so they get an appreciation for it.
I made the comment after I looked through it that I thought the financial sector was heavily regulated.
Yeah, and that was a great comment, and I thought healthcare was too until you look at this. But thank you again, and like I said, I'll circulate to you guys.
Okay.
Thank you.
While we have you here, in terms of schools, brand new Oxford, other 3 schools are significant investments there, over 160 million across 4 schools. How is that progressing?
Absolutely, to use a term, brilliant. The staff are thrilled, the community's thrilled. Jill and Chris run a tight ship with that building committee, and the members of the building committee do a fabulous job. We're on schedule, we're on time. I'm hoping that, I don't think I've advertised it just yet, but I'm offering a day for public officials to come and join us and walk through the building as you currently is, because there's enough there to it's come alive, right? There's enough there to really see and appreciate what's going on. So you'll have that invitation pretty quickly. We will do it during the day if you can. If you can't, we'll arrange another time in May, but it'll be a wee opportunity maybe for the first selectmen, other people, other boards to come and see the fruits of their labor. But it's absolutely fabulous. The architect, construction crew have been brilliant to work with our kids. It's actually run extremely smoothly at the moment. Everything's on schedule. The phasing, the principals have done a great job with the staff and the phasing, working with the parents. Couldn't be more pleased with what we're delivering, what will serve generations of kids. And it wasn't easy to do it all at once, but we did, and we are, and other people are doing it. And I'm just thrilled that the communities in those local areas can actually tap into that resource, and we're not waiting for another 4 years to start one building at a time. It will be beautiful. The exteriors of the buildings are kept in context of the surrounding neighborhoods. It's just fabulous. I couldn't be more thrilled for people and proud of people and excited at the same time. Those are the things that get a superintendent excited, right? Getting things from, but it's just fabulous. And I want to say too, by the way, auditorium, for instance, there is a community joint effort between the Board of Finance, and the whole entire community of what they have put in that auditorium to bring, it already was first class, but state of the art is an understatement. It's just a fabulous thing to see.
You could really see the video wall in action when they just did Les Mis. It was incredible, because they were able to use the same scenery and just change the video wall in the background. And I fully believed I was looking at a river, and then I was at a wedding in a gorgeous manor or manse in France. So if you haven't had a chance to see a clip of Les Mis, reach out. We have some. It was really incredible. Of course, the students are amazing.
There's so much attention put on the operating budgets that I feel like some of these mega projects, 100 million for these 3 schools, what we've done, the brand new Oxford School, the auditorium, the track, a lot of this stuff, I think unfortunately kind of falls by the wayside because everyone spends so much time focusing on the operating budget, which is important, but we still need schools to operate in, and there's been massive investment in those. One of the reasons why, it's not just the Board of Ed, there's been investments on the town side, but it's one of the reasons why the debt service will be up this year, in the 19% range, depending on, we're going to market in 2 weeks, but.
Yeah.
I know you know this, but it's why people come here. Like a big reason why people come here, live here, settle here, both to work and to live. It's super. So.
Agreed. On the capital side, it's like 60% of your capital spending, which is relatively low this year, is on paving. Paving at the high school and paving at Tokenique. I think Tokenique was, remind me, that was deferred from last year.
Deferred from last year,
Yeah.
yes.
The high school's going to be 20 years old, but next year I think it's 20 years old.
And the cost of that, I believe, is less now than last year?
It is
by
less
a
than we
little
put
bit?
forward last year. Oil prices are down, so, the quotes that we received when we built the capital budget were down slightly. So that's one of the reasons why it's down from, I think it was 310 down to about 285.
Got it. And we think these are at the point where they're a need to have?
I think Tokenique is definitely at the point where it needs to be done. The high school, it's at that 20-year cycle, and it was at the time where, it was ready to be done. You could choose to do what you did with Tokenique, similar to last year. The world won't end if it doesn't get paved, but it's getting to that point at 20 years. It needs attention.
And this will do both the paving and the sidewalk that's adjacent to it?
For the high school?
No, for Tokenique?
For Tokenique, correct. Yeah, there's some drainage work that has to be, yeah.
As a skeptic at Tokenique a year ago, I'm no longer a skeptic.
Okay. Any other questions? Capital? Okay. Well, appreciate your time.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Adams.
Rich, thank you for all the work.
And thanks to the Board of Education for
Great.
everything. Appreciate it.
Sugar? Anybody need sugar?
I gave up, but she said she had one.
I'm sorry, I'm not staying.
Well, did you have other questions or no?
You ended up having no questions.
Thank you, folks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Adams.
Thank you, Dr. Adams.
Thank you.
Jen's back.
Okay. Why don't we go through, what do you want to do first, Jen? Bonding, debt service?
Yeah, that works.
What are you working on? Sorry if I went back to you. It's okay.
Oh my God, I have everything wrong.
A lot of meetings.
How did that go today?
Where, do we have this document, or are we following along on the screen?
You do not have
Okay.
this particular.
Okay, thank you.
You're all getting a sneak peek into the way my brain works right now. Oh, okay. Do you want to go over what Mark sent, or you want me to talk about the difference between that and what we have budgeted?
Why don't you go, you can do.
Okay. So in the budget, we assumed borrowing about 44 million for bonding.
and we're actually borrowing about 49 million. What we assumed in the budget came out to about 1.7 million of interest on the new issue, and we assumed a 3.9% interest on the $49 million ban. What we got today was an updated debt service schedule based on the 49 million that we're borrowing, current market conditions, that kind of thing. And because we are borrowing more, let me know if this is too small. The debt service is actually more than what we had anticipated when we put the budget together. So right now, and we'll know for sure when we actually bond, but right now the projection is just over $2 million in interest on the bonds. So we have about a $300,000 increase, but that would be offset by the additional earnings that we expect to get, which was part of the reason why we borrowed the 15 months of cash flow instead of the 12. But I would expect that when we sell the bonds next week, and I have the final debt service numbers for you, there will be an increase in the interest in the budget.
But to your point, the way we think about it, like the extra amount we're borrowing is really for, I guess I think about it like April, May, June of 2026.
Exactly.
So those dollars will be borrowed at X%,
And they will be
plopped back
sitting
in, invested,
for the year.
and effectively cover their cost.
Yep.
So from a,
Sorry, and what's causing the 44, 49, was that just us?
That was the additional that we borrowed on HHR. And there were a couple of the small projects. We spent a little bit more than I had anticipated, so we're reimbursing more, but it's primarily the extra 3 months of HHR.
Because I think we were a little bit behind when we did, remember we were asking for cash flow.
Yep.
I think it came a little late.
Yep.
Okay.
Is that in your spreadsheet yet?
No, so we could start going over that. What I'm going to send out to you, I started putting it together today, is a list of potential changes that then flows through each of the departments and into the summary. So I will get that out to you tomorrow morning, but I also want to add in the updated tax information, the fiscal 25 projection, and fund balance information. So I want to get that to you tomorrow so we can talk about it on Thursday. That's all I had on that. Did you have anything else?
I think, Jenny and I spent some time going through our existing indebtedness, right? And I think, there's really nothing currently callable. And there are some low coupon pieces of debt we have. And so we thought a little bit about whether it may make sense to defease. But I think where we've been both generally got to is that the dollar amounts are not that large. We can actually take advantage of the cash flow savings by whether we take that like $1 million and go buy a treasury at 4 and defease it, or just invest that $1 million at 4. From a cash flow standpoint, it's the same. And I think as we discovered 4 or 5 years ago, you really need to have it be large enough, because by the time you add up like $5,000 for bond counsel and the fees and escrow and verification agent, you need to be sort of a couple $1 million to make it be worthwhile. So I think, given that we can achieve the same quote, kind of positive arbitrage versus the coupons by just investing it, I think we thought it was worth looking at, but not necessarily, acting on. And I think, overall on the debt service, basically it's, out of, Jen, what's the total number? Looks to be kind of 15 and change?
Yeah, 15.4. I dropped in the extra 300 that we're looking at right now, that puts us up to 15.4.
Yeah. And so like when I looked at that, the composition of it is about 7.6?
Between school and town?
Yeah, I mean, it's slightly more on the school side.
Schools at 7.9, and I will say I just dropped the full 309 into schools, so 7.9 on schools, 7.2 on the town, and only 235,000 for sewers.
Got it. And on the town side, that does include the interest on the band.
Yes.
That we would issue.
Yep.
Right? And this, I guess, excludes a little bit of if we were to issue at a net premium.
Yes. Typically if we end up getting a premium, what we have done is just apply it to the project so that we have to borrow less.
Yep.
And we didn't do any, when you approved the resolution to sell, we didn't do anything to resize it back down to the 49 million because we know that we do have additional HHR, so if we have premium, it can be applied there. Next time that we issue for HHR and we're at the end of the project, we probably want to, in the resolution to sell, so that we would readjust if we got a premium.
Got it. And then in terms of, we talked a little bit about what we're going to do with the bond proceeds, like the 49 odd million, and it sounds like we're going to open up a new account at STIF.
Yep. That is the plan, yes.
And we'll hold these, like the proceeds of this specific bond issue will sit in its own account.
Yeah, it's going to be a separate Town of Darien account at STIF. So it'll be segregated, the interest will be very clear that that was the interest on the bonds. One thing that you will see as you see the financial reports throughout the year, in consultation with bond counsel, their recommendation is because typically you would apply that interest to credit it back to the individual projects, but because our interest, the borrowing interest, the cost of it is more than what we're going to earn out, we can bring it into the general fund to offset the carrying costs. But their recommendation is that we do that at the end of the year and just let it accumulate in that STIF account and then move all the interest in at year end and just show that it wasn't used for anything other than offsetting the interest.
Do we have a firm in mind to do that? Because now you're subject to reporting, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a firm in mind you were looking at using?
We used one last year to get caught up with the increase in rates. So we would use the same firm.
Which one was it? BLX or?
The name Amtech comes to mind, but I may be thinking of something else. I'll have to look.
Okay. And what are those? What do they charge? Like a couple grand?
It was a significant last year because we had multiple years that we were getting caught up on. It's a few $1,000s.
Yeah. Okay.
And so as we think about those investment earnings, those have not been included. The investment earnings from this like 49 odd million are not included in the budget.
Right.
So I think it's important when you look at those, that really we have to break them up in two different pieces. If we close in kind of April 25th, is it, or 24th?
24th is
24th. So from the 24th through June 30th, those investment proceeds, which could be kind of 150 to 200,000, that'll accrue towards this year, right, Jen?
Yeah, we had had an exchange about that, and it started clicking in my brain. That actually, I think, because we're not going to have any interest on those bonds in the current year, we should credit that
this year
100, 200,000 to the projects. So we'll have to borrow that much less on the projects, but I would say we shouldn't sweep it into the general fund in the current year because it's not offsetting any interest on those bonds.
Okay, so that increased in investment return, it won't necessarily bring up our quote excess or surplus from the Board of Selectmen side. Okay, and then in terms of from July 1 through June 30 of 2026, that I think we both run numbers and it seemed to be like in the 5 to 550 area.
Yeah, low fives.
And so that was not reflected in any of the numbers that you and the treasurer put together, right?
Correct.
So that's something, that would be a net add to, and will you incorporate that into the model?
Yep, absolutely. And I forwarded to you today Joan reprojected, and,
Are we switching to investment earnings? Sorry, you just said that.
Well,
I guess we're flowing.
Yeah, we kind of transition a little bit just in terms of these investment earnings.
Well, the only thing I'm just wondering, and maybe I've missed something here, is, the numbers that you've worked on, I know, this is the same calculus, right? You said interest expected on the 49 million is 2 million-ish?
Interest expense on the
Okay.
bonding.
All right,
Yeah.
sorry.
And so if the question's like, we're going to pay $2 million of interest in between the 200,000 this year and the 500 or so next year, that's only like 750,000 versus the 2 million we're paying, and that's because we're spending down the bond proceeds over, an average life of like under 6 months.
Yeah.
So it defers some of the net interest cost, but not all of it.
Mechanically, Jen, just to make sure I get this, so the 49 million goes in a STIP fund, right? And it only gets drawn down as cash is needed for the HHR project?
Yeah,
Am
we
I
usually
Am I
do,
getting that
so
right?
the full 49 million won't go in because we'll reimburse ourselves a few million for what we've already spent.
Spent on it, right.
And hadn't yet borrowed on HHR or other small projects. So say 46 or so would go into STIF. And then each month, usually at the end of the month, we would do a draw from STIF. Right now it's from JP Morgan for the bondable projects that were part of that issue, what was spent, that the general fund paid, and at the end of the month, we would transfer
Just
over.
transferred over, okay.
If we were, towards the end of the year, May, June, cash can get a little tight, so we might look and say we have $3 million going out the door for HHR this week. As soon as it goes out, we might move from STIF.
And is STIF still around 4.3? Is that what
I think it was about 4.22 the other day when I looked.
Okay.
The daily rate, I think, was 4.45, but in terms of, Jen, being able to get that money, is that basically 1 day notice?
Yeah.
T+1, you can get it back in your account or operating account?
Yep. Yeah, it's very,
Pretty
very quick.
John?
Yeah, so.
Hey, John, I'm going to get yelled at by Mr. Cameron if I don't tell you to come up to the table.
You'll have to get in line, I'm being yelled at about
Let's want that, right?
So if you're setting up a STIF account to take the HHR bond proceeds to earn during the time that money's not yet spent, that makes good sense. Would you be setting up another STIF account? So anytime we get bonded funds and there's any lag between sort of the arrival of that money and the disbursement of that money, even if it's all going to be spent all at once, even that little bit of time is technically time we could earn money on those proceeds. And so we have an efficient set of those STIF accounts to do that for every single bond offering or bond proceeds that we get to maximize earnings, even if they're small in some of those cases. A, is that feasible, and if so, is that the plan?
When we were not borrowing large amounts for schools, and if we return to that kind of a normal borrowing practice, typically we would spend the money first. We would cut the check for the fire apparatus and whatever other small projects, and then we'd go out to bond and we'd reimburse ourselves, and there would be no funds
There would be
sitting around
no
and
lag.
earning. So if we go back to that model, after we get through some of these large ones, I don't envision having multiple STIF accounts. What we've done over the last few years is accumulate all of it in a JP Morgan bond account. It was just for bond proceeds, nothing else ran through there. Best practice would be to have separate accounts for each bond issue. But with reporting out of Munis and being able to easily separate all of these by bond issue on the ledger and send them out to a reporting entity, we probably don't need a STIF account for each year, for each issue.
Yeah, because depending on what the appropriation strategy is for whatever we decide is phase 3 for Great Island, you could see that being appropriate in advance. And you could have actually proceeds in the bank before we need.
Yeah, that would be one of the large ones where we would borrow
Duration
in
notice.
advance for cash flow.
John, I always think about it when we kind of spend money from the general fund and then reimburse it with bond proceeds. It's really like we're basically investing our general account at the cost that we would have otherwise borrowed at for the money that's sitting around, because we're
you're not
using
borrowing.
cash on
Because you're
hand
not
rather than
borrowing.
borrowing at like
That's fine. Yep.
3.5%. And Jen, one of the questions as we get to like how much money we might be able to contribute via the general fund, right? I always look at the kind of calls on the general fund, right? Which HHR was a big one.
Yep.
Have we looked at how many other kind of bonding appropriations are currently borrowing from the general fund for not yet bonding it? Just so, because we always talk about a $30-odd million surplus, right, that we have, but some of that is actually attributed.
Yeah, for cash flow, it's going to be used
Yeah.
for, we have 3 pieces of fire apparatus, a couple are, we made one progress payment on one of them, but a couple of them are going to be completed in the next year or so. We'll pay on those. We have nothing huge. We have a lot of small projects. Other than HHR, we don't have anything huge. So we do have a list. We know what the appropriation is, what we've borrowed so far, and we can assume that we're going to spend it all, and that it would be fronted from the general fund.
And if it's anything that's significant, you got to make sure that you take that out of projected investment earnings, for that cash is not available to earn during that time.
And I think we still have a few, like $4 or $5 million extra from Great Island, or $4
Right.
million maybe. That's
Right, and so that, when we roll the notes, because we've had it for so long, we do have to yield restrict on the unused note portion. So that can't go into STIF. We'll keep that in our JP Morgan account, which is below what our arbitrage yield is.
okay. And we could have multiple accounts at STIF. So because we currently have some money there,
Right.
regardless, away from the bond proceeds, right?
Right.
And remind me what the time limit is for funds before you have to limit the yield?
Before you have to yield restrict,
Is
you
it
have
18 is it 18 months?
24 months for construction projects.
24 months?
They have to be substantially expended within 24 months.
There's a spend down schedule.
Yeah.
It's like 10% for the first 6 and
45%.
Yeah.
That's right, because then the Great Island appropriate funds don't really have a spend down schedule that's attached to them. That's another kind of problem with that it doesn't match up against, say, a construction loan where you'd have all that projected out. We don't really have that.
Well, I think the fact that we spent 85 of the 90, within like one day of borrowing, I think allowed us to hit our
Yes.
spend down requirements.
Yes.
Okay, so any other questions on bonding here?
No.
Okay. Investment earnings.
Can I just ask,
Oh,
did you got a Moody's, did you guys already have a rating agency meeting? Or
Yeah, we had that last week.
And that went okay?
It went very well.
Great, okay.
Good. Have we heard back officially yet, or?
We got the draft press release today and gave them the okay, so I think they release it tomorrow.
Got it. Okay.
And it's AAA? For the record, for the record.
For the record. That was going to be the big reveal, Jenny.
April Fool's.
Yes. Our bondholders can rest at night.
That was the rose ceremony at the end of the meeting.
Yeah. Okay. So next is investment earnings. We hit on some of it related to the new bonding, and so it sounds like, Jen, we're just somewhere between 500 and 550.
Right, for the bonding, because at the time that the treasurer projected it, we didn't know what we were going to be, how much we were going to be issuing. So I did forward to you today, she did a reprojection on Monday and then provided some additional information this afternoon. So initially, when she reprojected, she was coming up with 3.3 million. Right now, the budget's at 3 million. But she did do a recast today with a 75 basis point drop, which then would bring investment income down to 3.1 million. And that excludes anything that we would earn on the bonds.
Was that drop, I wasn't sure, was that a right out of the box drop, or was this assuming it's effectively at the June meeting to start on July 1?
It was spread throughout the year.
3 rate drops of 25 each.
Yep.
Got it. So basically, between the 3.3 million, it's an extra 300,000 that she's forecasting, and then an extra kind of 550 here. We're looking at an extra 850 of revenue. So bringing, let's say, aggregate investment earnings, Jen, unless I'm missing, the 3.3, I think, did that encompass general fund and the reserve fund for capital non-recurring expenditures?
No, that's just for the general fund.
Okay. And so do we not, okay, so,
There's a very small allocation that goes to
Okay.
reserve.
so it's really up another 8 to 850, right?
And our budget, the budget we sent was 3 million?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Pardon me, did I just miss something? Because if Joan just predicted instead of 3.3, 3.1, then you're only talking about a 650 increase, not 800, unless I'm missing something here. Because
She basically said if there's 2 rate drops, it's 3.3. If it's 3 rate drops, it's 3.1, and she said you could use either number. So
okay, that's what I wanted to understand. All right.
And it's negligible in the non-recurring.
Yes.
And either one of those numbers has that 850 in there,
Pardon?
or no?
No.
No.
So that's on
it doesn't.
top?
No, it's versus what the Board of Selectmen sent to you, which is 3 million. So you're either going to take 3.3 plus 5 or 3.1 plus 5.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So I mean, I think.
But offset by
yeah.
the 300 additional interest that we talked about. Right, that's how to look at it from a larger standpoint.
Yes. So I feel like we should be directionally taking at least a 3.3 number. And I think in terms of investment earnings, you know, kind of, whether it's 500 or 550, those should be in there.
So what I will do, I'll put 850 in here as a placeholder. We can circle back and talk about it as part of our final wrap-up, but you'll be able to see what that impact does. And if you change it, you can see what the impact would be.
What I'd like to see is those rate increases are built into the market. And I think you took the market and applied it to the cash flows. So with the sensitivity analysis, I get more comfort level around bumping it up by that level, 850, right? There's going to be 3 rate drops, 25 basis points each, and we need to be more conservative as a result. There's one way of thinking about it. There's a separate and additional way of thinking about it. Okay, that's in the curve. How does the curve apply to our cash flows, and do they sync up?
Yeah, I think the one, like in terms of, you know, there's a lot of levers you can pull to look at to be conservative on this or to be accurate on this, if you will.
Yes.
I started with the Fed funds future rate curve, and then I looked at sort of where STIF has generally sort of priced out. You know, STIF is primarily derived from investments in U.S. Treasuries, kind of short-term 0 to 12-month T-bills, and then kind of extremely high-grade CP. And it's generally been around 20 to 25 basis point spread between the Fed funds rate and the STIF daily rate. And then I haircut it by 25 basis points. One thing which I think we're not assuming, or I guess there's a couple things, in terms of the spend down, we're basically assuming that we kind of draw it down out of STIF 30 days after we get the invoice, right?
Yes.
And then one thing we're not including is, you know, we do get this, or we should get state grants, right, throughout the year, but we're assuming, at least for the spend down, that we don't, all of the project costs out through basically May, I think it was, most of May, were all funded just from bond proceeds. So a couple things could happen. Assuming we get some dollars from the state, those dollars would either go in the general fund, and Joan would be investing those, or those dollars would be used to pay the invoices that Jen is getting, and the balance that we have inside of STIF would stay kind of $2, $3, $4 million higher for another 2 months. So, you know, we've kind of taken an extremely conservative approach into not including any state grants. And then on top of that, we've taken about a 25 basis point haircut off of, you know, Fed funds implied STIF rates.
And that's the analysis you did on bond proceeds, but not on, like, our general fund.
Correct. Yeah, it's just on bond
I'd
proceeds.
really like to see a calculation. Can you get us a spreadsheet of how the 3 or 3.1 or 3.3 is calculated?
I can ask Joan what she can provide.
You kind of did one last year. I think you might have done it.
Yeah,
I mean,
Maybe
if
with
we
Joan's
build it
help. Do you remember it was
ourselves,
kind
then
of
we
like
can do that,
multi-columns and it had almost like bank account dollars, how long it's going to stay in there for, maturity? It kind of rolled into our three, whatever we had last, 3 number. It's that spreadsheet, remember? Is that what you're looking for, potentially?
Something like that.
Yeah.
Just a calculation, to look
Yeah.
at.
But I think there's chunks to it, Taylor, saying like.
Oh, it makes sense, absolutely.
it's-
I mean, we
it was
used
a
to
really-
have a
it was
lot more
It
information
was
than
a
we
really
have
good
now.
analysis last year. It kind of said, instead of putting, that account's going to have an average of $20 million, and the year it's going to be 12, and then we just recalculated as we kind of changed it. I think
Yeah.
that's what we want.
I mean, well, we get the tax inflows and then they get spent, and then we get another tax inflow mid-year, it gets spent, like, they're all invested.
Yeah.
You can make assumptions, you can tweak it, but all I have is a whole number of 3.1 or 3.3 to choose from.
Jen, in terms of like high level, I think 2 numbers would be helpful. I'm not sure if you have them, or maybe this is a setup, you already have them, but like what does like $100,000 or $500,000 do to the year-over-year increase? And then what does it do to, like, what's the effect on the mill rate? Because this is, I think in terms of large numbers, we're looking at, it's, 850 of investment income, that it feels like we're all sort of honing in on. The other large numbers I see out there are potential extra 500,000 or so related to the healthcare cost by moving from United Healthcare to the state plan, if that were to happen.
Yeah, that we will know. I've told the unions that we need to come to a decision by April 8th.
Okay.
All right, so $100,000. Oh, I don't have that phone through here.
Isn't it $110,000 for one mill, which when we went before with 8.5 billion being 85,000 to affect it?
$100,000 gets you 0.01 mil change.
And what does that do to the overall percent increase of the mill rate?
It's going to be very minimal.
You're talking about a point, just $100,000 delta.
And what has to be equal to a grant? Yeah, for every bill.
0.0. It is like 6-7 basis points.
Okay. So in terms of other numbers, we have investment income, we have potential healthcare savings, and then we have surpluses, right? Looks like we have, I think per Rich, about 460,000 that they're currently estimating at the Board of Ed. I think our last number, you guided us towards about $1.1 million.
On the expenditure side, about 1.4 on the revenue side.
1.1 expense surplus.
Yep, on the town side.
And 1.4 revenue surplus.
Yep.
And investment income, well, I'm sorry, and then, the Board of Ed was 460.
Yep.
Yeah.
Agreed to. Jen, that 1.4 in revenue, that's obviously mostly investment income?
No, it's mostly tax revenue, because we budget conservatively.
Like 99.
Yeah, take 25 basis points off of
So
it.
that's the.
That's the majority of it. And I think we billed out about 150,000 more on supplemental tax than we had anticipated, and that has pretty much 100% collection rate.
And how far behind are we on, which ones, was it like building permits? That was lagging behind?
We're still behind, and I have emailed them again and asked for an update. So that's actually a placeholder.
I think that's going to be
I think that's going to have
That's going to be a
come down.
decent sized miss on that one.
Yep.
So
Yeah, I think
you got
that's-
investment income up, you got tax revenues up, and then you got the miss on building
Yep.
permits.
So Jen, in terms of 1.1 plus 1.4 plus the 460,000, right? That's kind of 2.9, and that's against the 4.8. What's our what's our non-bonded capital between Board of Ed and Board of Selectmen? I think Board of Ed was 1.3 total.
Yes.
So I think, is that 4 point?
We had 5.9 to be raised by taxes.
Capital.
Yep, for capital.
Both ways. Board of Ed.
Including, no, town. Just town?
That's town and Board of Ed.
Town and board, okay.
Okay, I thought Board of Ed,
They're
Board of
only
Selectmen
one-
capital was,
They're like 1.3?
They're 1.3.
oh, sorry, yeah, okay, that's right. So 1.3 and 4.8, right?
Yep.
So those dollar amounts, in terms of rolling them over, if we were to use them to buy capital, there's like capital's more than sufficient to be able to use those proceeds, because we don't want to use those proceeds for operating expenses.
Right. So with those three changes, what does the percentage increase look like and mill
Well,
rate increase look
Let
like?
me tell you what I have in for changes right now as placeholders.
Okay.
Couple of these we've already talked about. Decrease in full-time salary in the is that large enough? In the finance
Yeah, we can see.
department of just under 16,000. We got the update from the library, so that's a $3,000 increase as they were truing up theirs. The big one that we talked about last time was changing the fire administrator to part-time. And then I assumed a reduction in the hourly rate, given that it would be a part-time position, not a full-time position. So the total savings, primarily of cutting the salary and then not having benefits, is just under $90,000 for that. And then I did put in the $309,000 increase for debt service for interest. One that we're waiting on, we just got our notification of hydrant charges, and the fire marshal's calculating what he thinks we can make an adjustment on that. He thinks it's going to be moving in a positive direction. So some reduction there, but he's just got to finish the calculation on it.
Okay.
Then what's factored in already is an additional $850 in investment income. And then on the capital side, from what I sent to you last week, the Park and Rec sound system, reduce it down to a $5,000 purchase, just buy a one speaker, smaller system that can be added on to if they find that they need it. And then no budgetary impact, because it's going to be on the expenditure and revenue side with capital. It's just bringing down the Weed Beach and Pear Tree projects to the most recent bid or estimate. And that would just reduce what we're going to assume for bond proceeds. So with all of that, we are up. Amount to be raised for taxes for the general fund, 6.23%. Amount to be raised for taxes before any fund balance contribution is up 3.6 million, which is 159%. Overall mill rate would be 15.82, which is a 7.69% increase over the current year.
Now, if you were just to take the 296 from the respective, quote, surpluses, how does that change the math? And this is absent any investment income changes and any healthcare changes.
Right. So that would bring the mill rate down to 15.56, which is a 5.92%.
And if you added, just real quick right there to that 2.96, if you just added on another 850, or I guess subtract another 850?
Based on what? Because we already have the investment income.
Oh, it is? Okay, that's in
Yeah,
there.
I was gonna say the
Yeah.
investment income's in there. Yeah. There's contribution.
And then what is that growth rate pre-debt service? If you scroll up.
Well, we have on the Board of Selectmen budget, right now, we're at a 4.41% increase, and Board of Ed is at a 4.9%
Thank you.
increase.
Okay, that's what I was looking for.
Yep.
So in terms of other things, Jen, I think last year we showed a $6 million conservatively above the Moody's target, and we used I'll say like 3 million in the budget, but we use one for a special appropriation and some to contribute to the budget. It'd be good to, how close are we to being able to have an update in terms of where we are versus we think that Moody's number, given that you just,
You'll get that by the end of the day tomorrow.
got it.
Hey, Jim, we had skipped over the Great Island discussion, which is on tonight's agenda, so before we start breaking, we need to cover that.
Anything else we should be looking at? I guess on top of this, that current number right there doesn't have the extra 500,000, or it does for the healthcare insurance?
It has nothing additional for health insurance.
Okay.
Jim, certain concerns, but other things that the board can look at. From everything I'm hearing and from conversations, there's no guarantee that the 460 is coming back. So that's something to consider. Number two, they currently have in their budget an excess cost reimbursement of 65%, which they moved down. But even though it's not, the 40 million isn't funded for 26, everyone I've spoken to anticipates that it will be, which could move it up to 70%. That's a $200,000 increase in their excess cost, not affecting any of their education, but that's about 2 mils. If we went to the 72%, which they're getting this year, that's a $250,000 increase in excess cost, with the guarantee, which we've always done, that if they don't hit that number, the Board of Finance and the RTM would guarantee the difference for what they have. So I've mentioned to one of the board members, I've spoken to Alan about that. With our guarantee, we're not really affecting their budget. What we do is we're tightening it up to be more realistic to what it is. We're not cutting education, we're just addressing excess cost. In addition, if they're not paying back to the town the 460, my joke to Jen is that maybe we should set up an equivalent fund for the town so they could have 1.1 million hanging out there. But the fact of the matter is that when they went through the list of what they presented of what they might use it for, the last option was paying down the budget, but they're going to be meeting a day after the RTM approves the budget, so that option is out. The other things that were above, none of them were paying down any of the things that were in their current 26 budget. They were either adding things back to what was cut in the 26 budget, or even looking proactively to 27. So that may be another, that their comment was that they were depending upon how much they do get back from excess cost. But I'm under the assumption, based upon the people that I've spoken to, that the lapsing account, which is totally within their authority to set up without anybody else's approval, is going to be set up. So the question is, do you also want to take down between 400 to 350 off of their budget, with the understanding that if they don't get the funds that they've calculated, which is sitting on Rich's budget calculation, that we would make that up as well. But that's a total of someplace with about 500,000 without really affecting anything. So, you know, they have the 400,000 if they want to use it to pay down their 26 things now and pre-buy things. That's fine. They already have that money, and it's not coming down. We did that 2 years ago, where they had some extra money, they approved a budget, they paid down some expenses. Jim and I, we were talking about that. That was about 200,000, but then they reduced their budget. They're not doing that this year.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I just want to raise that this is all excess costs. The 500, 550 that we would be reducing, it comes with a guarantee that if they don't hit what they get back from excess cost, we'd cover it in the general fund, or if they don't get back the 72% or 70%, we would cover that as well. But I'm not sure we want to be sitting out there with 600,000, 700,000 in this year of what could very well be a cookie jar.
Yeah, I personally don't expect them to, I expect them to return all the money back to the general fund as they have in the last 4 or 5 years. I mean, listen, they spent a very long time deliberating that budget. I think we all heard them. I think by my count, I heard 9 members of the Board of Ed all take Dr. Adley's budget that he and his C-suite and his administration all approved, and they raised that by, I think, like $400,000 or $500,000. And then 9 people unanimously voted that that budget was the budget that they felt could deliver everything that they needed to for fiscal '26. So my expectation is, given that they all voted unanimously for that if they have this 460-odd thousand, give or take, that they would return that to the general
But even
fund.
with that, moving the excess cost up, and as I said, I spoke to Dr. Adley, and he had no problem with that, moving it up to a number with the guarantee that if you don't make the 70% or 72%, we'd cover your charges, I think is more than reasonable in this year's budget. But, you know, to be honest, I can't do that on the floor of the RTM.
What do you think of that, Paul?
As long as there's a good faith discussion between both parties.
Yeah,
I mean,
the
about
good faith has been that the Board of Finance and the RTM has met every time they raise their hand for delivering money. And so this is, and I agree with you.
I'm talking about
but
more about the
that's-
ECR next year.
Yeah, we're talking about next year's ECR. And, you know, even Dr. Adley admitted to me that he expects to be funding. I've spoken to several legislators, and the problem is that they don't know where that 40 million is currently coming from. And that's why it wasn't put into the budget. But it will be during next year, because they're not going to
But
have.
it's not only the funding of the 40 million, it's how much is the total expense.
I fully understand.
Because the expense went up dramatically last year.
Understand, but again.
That is what drove the reimbursement rate down.
Yeah, but they're
the
not coming
funding.
down next year either. I anticipate that there'll be more things funded. But again, if the Board of Finance and the RTM, and I can speak for the RTM on that, if we're guaranteeing if they don't hit that number, we'll cover them, we have a history of being able to do that. So we're reducing a number, but not reducing education. We're increasing the revenue.
I actually take comfort in or appreciate, respect Rich Rudel's explanation as to why they budgeted what they budgeted. So I prefer to not adjust the number given the level of expertise they deliver to that judgment versus mine.
Well, having done this for 20 years, and I also come with a little bit of expertise, and their number historically has been 70%, not 65. They're getting 72% this year. They got 70% last year. They moved it down based upon what was going on. 65 has not been a number that they've used in the past. And again, if we're willing to cover, it is something that has a guarantee to it. So I have more trust in our guarantee than theirs.
Okay. Well, I think, listen, I can follow up with Jill on that, but there are 2 sort of different items. As one, you know, will they be returning the $460,000? My expectation is that as they will, given that 9 members unanimously voted for something that they had already added to. The second, Jack, is whether or not they would, you know, as a board, change their assumption. You know, I can follow up with Jill on that.
I'll also
See if they feel
follow up with
comfortable.
And is
Joe.
there
I
any
spoke to
other-
John Sini about it, and he said with the guarantee, he had no problem.
Are there any other concerns about federal grants that might show up that we should be earmarking for?
I don't think you get much.
They have 1.1 million in
Yeah.
federal grants that are associated with special ed. That's usually an amount that's given out by Congress. It's supposedly that grant, with the demise of the Department of Education currently, would be moving over to JFK Junior.
Health and Human Services.
Yeah.
That's the Individual with Disabilities Educational Act.
Right. So that still should be coming in. Whether or not it's a block grant or how they're doing it might be different.
In terms of year-over-year changes, I think there's a Title I grant of $100,000 that they lost last year, so that's not in this year's grant. So I think that's like the big year-over-year change.
The big one is the special ed, and it's about $1 million, and there's another one that's about $100,000, both of which are tied to special ed. and that's the only stuff that they really have from the federal government that could be at risk, but everybody's saying they're still going to get a block grant. At least that's what the state anticipates. So I'm not worried about it.
Point taken. I think I can follow up with Joe on that. I think that everyone should just know there's a lot more variables than just the amount of money that the legislator puts in there. It's the amount of total submissions, and then just even locally here on a micro level, it's whether or not the a particular student's expenditures exceed, Paul's going to correct me, 4.5 times?
Yep.
4.5 times or not, so those things can all, so there's a lot of variables in there, not just how much.
Fully understand, but they had it at 70 and they moved it to 65 based upon what was happening today. The original budget was at 70, and they're getting 72 back.
Understood. Okay, so last item on the agenda, Jen, is the discussion about Great Island, and this is really the Great Island Special Revenue Fund. I asked to have a bit of a discussion on this. You know, the first year there was a fair amount of revenue because we had 7 or 8 different properties, including the stables, of which we were collecting $400,000 of revenue, and now I think all of the leases, John, expire in July 1 and June 30.
Fiscal year. Yep.
Yeah, so the negligible revenue that we have going forward. There is a budget that they put together in terms of overall expenditures that would be spent, if you will, on Great Island. It's going to be partially funded by a balance that exists, right, inside the current revenue fund, and then another by a transfer that would be included as an appropriation in this budget, right?
Correct. So is there a question?
Stop talking.
One of the points I raised and thought that we should consider here is, you know, when you look at other special revenue funds, like the one that we have at Parks and Rec, it's very, very specific. There are material revenues coming in related to, if you will, soccer camp, and there's very specific expenses that we take out of that fund, let's just call it, for the soccer coach and the soccer balls. Is that the right way to describe it, Jen?
Yeah. Program.
Okay, and generally there's about 25% more that we bring in, that we bring out, and that's a special revenue fund. You know, the Great Island Revenue Fund, you know, the revenue's effectively gone to zero, and I wanted to make sure that dollars being appropriated here have been budgeted, and that those are being used for the costs and the areas that they're originally budgeted for. So I had brought up the idea of whether or not this should just be, you know, collapsed this year, or as Jen suggested, I think next year, just into the Board of Selectmen budget as a whole.
Ask for clarification when you say make sure that they're budgeted, which they are, and that they're being spent the way that they are supposed to be. I want to make it clear that they are being spent the way that they're supposed to be. I don't know why you would think otherwise.
Yeah, I would just add that this gets as much scrutiny as anything in the Board of Selectmen budget. We're on top of this. We know about it. And so the idea that this is part of a separate fund doesn't mean there's less oversight, or that it's not budgeted, or it's somehow an orphan account that can go off and do its own thing. The only other thing I would point out is that it just so happens that we're at a point where there's likely zero revenue for a bit. But there's a substantial likelihood that something's going to come up in the very near term that's going to start generating revenue. So if we get rid of this account, it's entirely possible that once that happens, we're going to have to reinstate that account. So I get the need for monitoring this, but if that's really the only thing you're kind of worried about, I don't understand why having this separate account would lead you to suggest that this is being scrutinized or scrutinized less.
Yeah, no, my point was just that the revenue was exceeding the expenditures and so forth, and it wasn't, not all of the dollars were specifically earmarked towards those items that generate the revenues like we have in the Parks and Rec Fund.
Well, the way that this came to be was we knew that we had the rental income for a certain amount of time. And we know that there's expenses, whether the rental properties are vacant or not, there's expenses with maintaining the property. Mowing, you know, is the big one, but also the buildings need to be maintained, they need to be winterized, you know, that sort of thing. And there was a desire at the time by this board to make sure that we were tracking what is it costing us to run and maintain Great Island. So the fund was set up to make sure that we were separating all that activity. The way that the budget is designed for fiscal '26, it does bring it down and zeroes it out, assuming that at the end of '26, we're zero. But Jim and I did have some back and forth. Accounting-wise, it is absolutely acceptable to have it remain as a special revenue fund, even though it doesn't have revenue. It can still be a way to separate and account for the activities of Great Island in its own set of accounts. When it's reported in the financial statements, it would get rolled up as part of the general fund financials. But it's also perfectly acceptable accounting-wise to roll these expenses into maybe another division in DPW, or just, fit them in existing DPW accounts. We would lose the tracking ability. And to John's point, what I mentioned to Jim was, either way is fine, but I would like to have this exist for at least one more year while we're completing the master plan, see what comes out of that. What do we think we're gonna do at Great Island? Because I don't wanna collapse it and then we realize
Just start it again.
we're gonna start it again, and now we have kind of lost a year of tracking. But it is absolutely up to this board how you want to account for that, and either way is acceptable.
So Jen, let's just say there was some type of revenue, $200,000 worth of revenue, sort of came up, was taken in during '26. How would it go? How would the process be for spending that on, for spending that incremental money?
So you're saying like at the end of '26, we close the fund, what would we do, or?
Or just let's say throughout '26, we collect $200,000.
It would reduce what we would need to move from the general fund to support this right now.
Okay.
We assume that in '25, we make the full $225,000 transfer from the general fund that's budgeted, which gives us a $260,000 fund balance. And in '26, the '26 budget has about $76,000 transferred from the general fund, assuming there's zero revenue. If for some reason in '26 we take in $200,000 of revenue, we wouldn't need to transfer from the general fund, assuming the budget's all good and all the numbers hold, because we would use fund balance and that $200,000. And at the end of the year, we would have a balance remaining in fund balance for the Great Island Management Fund. And at that point, if we decided we wanted to close it out, we can do it budgetarily to transfer into the general fund.
But if $200,000 of revenue came in and we wanted to spend more than the $340,000, then it would have to come to what, back to the Board of Selectmen?
With the special revenue fund, it does not need to come back to you.
So would it go back to the Board of Selectmen?
No, because it is specifically for the management of Great Island. So if the money, say it was a filming permit, whatever, it goes into the Great Island Management Fund. It can only be spent on the Great Island Management Fund. It's not required to come back to you because this expenditure is within the purpose that you established.
Okay.
Right. I don't know how else to assure you that this gets looked at. DPW is very diligent of only charging Great Island expenses to here.
I think it's actually really helpful.
If there was a windfall, it would only be spent on Great Island management. It wouldn't be used for anything else.
I agree with Jen. Let this settle for a year. Right now, the way it's set up, it allows us to put a spotlight on it in a way that gets harder if you mix it in with everything else. Not impossible. Like Jen says, we're okay either way. But I think for now, this is a better approach, and let's take a look at it in 12 months. We'll have a lot more clarity as to what's next.
Any other questions on Great Island Fund? Okay. Any other general questions?
I was going to ask about when the vision plan will be done, right, in May, is that right?
The master plan will be delivered in July.
In July.
Yeah.
I just, with looking at the revenue, I know that the equestrian stables used to make us money, if that's being considered so that we can continue that.
We're not considering putting horses back at the stables, no.
Okay. Was there a Board of Selectmen discussion on that, or was that just the recommendation of the chief?
It's not something that's come out in the Great Island Committee's work. I'd further say that the problem is that the stables have capacity for 18 horses, as I recall. And it's not just the stables where you have to have horses, it's all lying around that, because the horses have to get out, they have to go to the dressage field, all of that. And just given the level of civilian traffic, pedestrians, dogs, and just the sheer volume of people, there's an impracticality at bringing somebody on board. The other problem you have is that even if we wanted to do that, nobody's going to want to commit to come to Great Island for a short period of time. That's part of the problem we had with the folks who were there last. We thought about trying to keep them for a while, but they wanted a 10-year lease. And we were not willing to tie up the stables for 10 years to give them that kind of commitment when we weren't sure really what the strategy was going to be. So my general view is that there's not really a place for permanent horse residents. There could be horse events, right, where they make use of the stables in some way to support an event, but not long-term.
But I think it's fair to say the Great Island Committee is certainly considering ways in which you could generate revenue, but doing that in a way also by thinking about, well, what's the equity investment that would need to be made in order to generate that revenue? So,
yep, all on the table.
Okay. With that, I'll take a motion to adjourn. Dan moves. Bob seconds. All those in favor? And